Welcome back to the Deep Dive. So in our series on why K-12 education struggles with data, we spent a lot of time on the individual. We've talked about skill gaps, and we've looked at those really harmful mental models that can stop analysis cold, even when the skills are there.
And those are definitely real. I mean, we know that training people and shifting those mindsets, those are absolutely necessary steps. But if we start there, we miss, well, the elephant in the room.
Right. Because the sources we looked at for today show something else.
Yep.
They show that even if you had the most perfectly trained, highly motivated educator,
Someone who gets it?
someone who totally gets it, they know stats, they know Excel, they genuinely want to improve student outcomes, that person would still run headfirst into a wall.
They would. And that's really the core idea of this deep dive. The infrastructure itself is just broken. We found that even the most competent people asking all the right questions, found themselves in systems that were, basically structured to guarantee failure.
So we're moving beyond individual blame here and looking at the structural barriers, the forms, the data flows.
And the institutional responses that actually end up punishing competence.
Okay, let's unpack this. This deep dive is really about flawed system design. It's about why these systems seem to prioritize bureaucracy over actual utility, right? And how that leaves the people who need information the most completely in the dark.
Absolutely. And to really get at that foundational flaw, we have to start with the direction data flows, or maybe the direction it doesn't flow.
You had this incredible story about this when you hired a guy who had just retired from the state education department, NCDPI.
Yeah.
His whole job was collecting data at the state level. Things like graduation rates. He was the person everyone reported to.
Exactly. So he retires. We bring him on to help local school districts, find and organize their own data, mostly for grant evaluations. And he walked in with this huge assumption.
Which seems reasonable.
Totally reasonable. He just figured, hey, someone in every single district knows how to pull the graduation numbers to send them to me at the state. So of course they know how to pull and use that same data for themselves. I mean, why wouldn't they? They're the ones who generated it.
What did he actually find on the ground?
He was just completely shocked. He found out really fast that the person in charge of compliance, the one who knew the reporting format, who could push the button to send the numbers up to the state.
The box checker?
The box checker. That person was often the only one who knew where those numbers even lived. And even they rarely had any idea how to pull that same data for, local decision making.
Wow. So they could fill out the state's form, but they couldn't actually use the information themselves. They could report the graduation rate, but they couldn't easily tell a principal which kids were most likely to drop out next semester.
That is the critical difference. It's compliance versus utility. The whole system, the whole workflow was designed to satisfy state and federal accountability reports. The data just flowed up.
Up to be judged.
Up to be judged by outsiders. It was never designed to flow back down in a way that was, flexible or accessible for the people on the ground.
Was this just about graduation rates, or was this a bigger problem?
Oh, it was everything. It was the same pattern across all the critical data, test scores, attendance data, discipline records, all of it flowed up. The state had this beautiful, complete picture of the whole system.
But the individual districts were blind.
They were. The school system that actually created all those numbers couldn't get them back in a usable way to, say, evaluate a new reading program they just started.
So just to be crystal clear here, the people closest to the students, the teachers, the principals, the ones who need that information in real time to see if an intervention is working.
Yeah.
They couldn't get their hands on the usable data about their own students, even though their district just produced it.
That's confirmed. The whole infrastructure was built top-down. The priority was the state's report card, which meant the local utility, the part that actually helped students, was just an afterthought, if it was a thought at all.
It's an environment where people are flying blind, but not because they want to.
Yeah.
The system itself is blocking the light.
It is. And that leads us right to the second big problem. It wasn't just that the data flowed in the wrong direction. Sometimes, when the state mandated how to report it, the forms they designed were, mathematically impossible to complete.
This is where it just gets absurd.
It's where you see a system designed by people who don't understand data, just guaranteeing bad information. I remember we were doing school safety reports for a really large district.
Reporting suspensions, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And the state changed the process. They got rid of the old system and said, okay, now you just have to fill out this Word document. It was just a big table.
Simple enough, you'd think.
You would think. The form had these different categories, like incidents on the playground, incidents involving a weapon, and incidents involving more than 2 students. And then at the bottom,
A total incidents box that had to add everything up.
precisely. The design just assumed that every incident could only fit in one box. It assumed the categories were mutually exclusive.
Which is statistically naive.
Very naive.
So let's walk through the problem for everyone listening. You've got one single event. 2 kids fight on the playground. One pulls a knife. That one incident fits all 3 of those categories. What happens when you try to report that accurately?
And that is the absolute crux of the problem. If I put a 1 in the playground box, a 1 in the weapon box, and a 1 in the multiple students box,
The form adds them up and says you had 3 incidents.
3 incidents, but there was only 1. My total is inflated by 200%. The state's final report is just mathematically wrong.
Okay, so what if you try to fix the total? What if you just put the 1 incident in the weapon box, since that's the most serious?
Then my total is correct, but I've just undercounted the number of playground incidents and multiple student incidents. There was no way to complete the form accurately. It was impossible.
That is an amazing bureaucratic trap. You're forced to lie about either the total number of incidents or the types of incidents. So obviously you called the state to point this out.
They did. I called and I very patiently explained that their form used non-mutually exclusive categories and that the totals would be statistically invalid.
And their response was not, "Oh, thank you for catching our mistake."
Their response was immediate. It was hostile. The actual quote was, "You're the only one asking questions like this. Maybe you're not the right person to complete this report."
Hold on. They designed a mathematically broken form. And when you, the person trying to give them accurate data, pointed out the basic logical flaw, you treated as the problem.
That is the key institutional pathology we're talking about here. The designers of the form didn't understand a fundamental concept of data. And when they were faced with proof of their error, the institutional culture was to defend the broken system by attacking the person who found the flaw.
It's a defense mechanism. Protect the system, attack the messenger. And it sounds like this wasn't just a one-time thing.
Not at all. It became a predictable pattern. Which brings us to the third barrier: mandated impossible metrics. We saw the exact same thing when we were hired to evaluate a statewide after-school program.
Who was funding that program?
It was a state agency, but, and this is key, it was not an education agency. They were great at their mission, but they just didn't get the reality of school data.
They had their own ideas about what data they wanted.
They did. They had these requirements for specific academic outcome data, certain test scores, certain metrics that they wanted us to report on, but they never checked if that data actually existed.
So they designed the requirements in a vacuum based on a wish list.
A total wish list. And of course, the schools didn't collect or track data in that specific way. The metrics they wanted literally did not exist anywhere.
So you go back to them and say, we can't report on metric X because it doesn't exist.
And we got that same chillingly familiar response. No one else has any questions, so maybe you can't do this evaluation.
Which can only mean one thing.
Right.
Everyone else was just making it up.
It's the only logical conclusion. They weren't even trying to be accurate, because if they had tried, they would have immediately run into the same brick wall we did. They were just, plugging in whatever numbers they could find, making approximations, anything to fill out the form and not cause trouble.
So once again, the only people who exposed the broken system were the ones actually trying to do the job correctly.
Yes. In this environment, competence becomes a liability. Being diligent means you find the flaw, and finding the flaw gets you labeled as difficult.
Or not the right person for the job.
Exactly, by the very agency that created the flaw.
So how did that particular situation end?
That one, thankfully, did get resolved, but it took years. The person who told us we weren't qualified was eventually replaced. The new leader came in, looked at this pile of reports from all the other evaluators, and realized they were just gibberish. Statistically, logically, they made no sense.
And then they saw your report.
And they saw our report. It was the only one that clearly stated which metrics were impossible and focused only on the data that could actually be verified. So EdStar was hired to do all the evaluations for every county in the state.
And you changed the metrics.
We had to. We changed them to things that actually existed. But even then, even after we fixed the mandate, we had to spend the next decade just helping districts find that data in their own systems. The infrastructure was that rusted shut.
So if you pull all this together, the data that only flows up, the flawed safety form, the impossible after-school metrics, there's a clear pattern. Whenever a competent person identified a flaw in the system's design,
The institutional response was to question the competence of that person, not to fix the flaw.
that's the toxic culture in a nutshell. It creates a system where asking a good, critical question, pointing out a simple statistical error, gets you marked as difficult.
It does, and the path of least resistance for everyone else is just to stay quiet. Fill in the forms, make up the numbers, just do what everyone else is doing.
Incompetence becomes the rational choice. It's safer.
It is. And the final predictable outcome of all this is what happens when the pressure to be data-driven gets really intense. The market reacts.
And you get the cottage industry of bad data.
Precisely. You have all these districts being told they have to use data, but their internal systems are a mess. So companies that used to just sell workshops, they pivot. They start selling tests.
Tests that claim to measure all the things the state wants to see.
But the products were often just meaningless. They weren't statistically valid. They weren't aligned to the curriculum. They didn't measure what they claimed.
How did they sell them?
The sales tactic was brilliant in a way. They'd hire retired superintendents, people with instant credibility and a great network, but who usually lacked the deep statistical expertise to know that the product they were selling was junk.
And districts just bought them, desperate for a solution.
They did. We were actually approached by 3 of these companies to validate their tests, so they could put a stamp of approval on them. We looked at the statistics, and we couldn't validate a single one. They were fundamentally unsound, but schools still spent thousands of dollars on them.
So they were buying meaningless data to feel like they were being data-driven.
That's it, exactly.
So when you put it all together, what does this mean? It feels like all the training we talked about in other deep dives, teaching an educator Excel, teaching them statistics, it's almost pointless if the system they work in makes using data accurately impossible or even risky for their career.
Training is necessary, but it is not sufficient. You can create the most brilliant data analyst in the world, but if you then drop them into a system where data only flows up and the forms can't be filled out correctly, you've wasted your money and you've crushed a motivated person. We have to change who designs these systems.
And we have to change the institutional response when someone finds a flaw.
That is the essential takeaway for you, the listener. The structural barriers are the real limiting factor. The training can't take hold until the infrastructure is fixed.
So if that institutional defense mechanism is to attack the person who spots the flaw, this brings up a huge question for any organization trying to reform itself. What is the single most essential cultural change needed before any real data system can work?
And I can guarantee you the answer isn't a new piece of software. It's not a new mandate. It has to be trust. And that's the challenge for you to mull over as you process this deep dive.